Hi, everyone. I am Sumitra from the Health Sciences Authority in Singapore. I currently actually head the Good Clinical Practice unit for the Innovation Office and Clinical Trials branch. So today I'm here to actually share with you how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the global regulatory environment and catalyzed the use of regulatory flexibility and innovative measures in clinical trials. So this is the overview of my presentation today. I will be sharing on the impact of COVID-19 on clinical trials, share with you HSA's regulatory facilitation due to COVID-19, as well as share with you some impact of COVID-19 on clinical trials moving forward. So it's been about more than 3 years since COVID-19 first started, and I'm sure it disrupted our day-to-day lives and even at work. Okay, so the impact of COVID-19 on clinical trials was to do with impacting on the trial participant safety, resources and facilities because there were visit restrictions at the local hospitals. As a result, the participants could not actually visit the local hospitals or use the facilities for the clinical trials, or there were stay-at-home notices for participants who actually contracted COVID. This also impacted the recruitment and retention of participants in clinical trials, and many sponsor companies had to come up with contingency measures to manage the impact of COVID-19 on their clinical trials. Supply chain for the investigational products and study supplies were affected. I still remember in February 2020, even before COVID-19 had really hit Singapore, we already were engaged by one of our cancer centers in Singapore to try to make arrangements for the products to be shipped overseas, because some of the patients were actually coming from overseas to Singapore for the purpose of the clinical trial. So we had to basically come up with a guideline, on very short notice and facilitate the direct-to-patient supply. Then it also impacted data integrity, as well as resulted in lots of non-compliances because of the missed study visits or study assessments. And trial monitoring by sponsors and audits, as well as GCP inspections by the regulatory agencies were also affected. So let us actually look at how regulatory facilitation was enabled at HSA. First of all, we adopted risk-calibrated regulatory flexibility and agility to accelerate the development of effective therapeutics and vaccines that were needed to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So what we did was we provided scientific and regulatory advice to sponsors and investigators to expeditiously advance promising therapeutics to clinical trials based on preliminary scientific evidence that potential benefits outweigh the risks. We also expedited the review of clinical trials through a rolling submission, where we actually encouraged the sponsor companies to submit the draft protocol, informed consent document, investigators brochure, as well as the chemistry, manufacturing, and control dossier to HSA before they were finalized, so that we could actually start reviewing them before providing our feedback, and then they could actually finalize the document. And this actually helped to speed up the approval timelines for the clinical trials during that period. We also provided regulatory guidances. There were two during the pandemic. Firstly was the conduct of clinical trials in relation to the COVID-19 situation. This particular guideline, we actually developed it in consultation with the FDA and EMA and MHRA guidances, because many of the clinical trials that are conducted in Singapore are multi-regional clinical trials. So we wanted to facilitate the contingency measures that were internationally recognized. We also developed guidance on electronic consents because there was a need to find other ways of obtaining consent from participants during the COVID-19 pandemic period. So how do you actually enable regulatory facilitation? It would be through engaging sponsors and investigators on protocol development, collaborating both on a local and international front, because in that case, we were involved in many committees, both locally as well as internationally for clinical trials. And also we regulated clinical trials of therapeutic products as well as medicinal products. So we continued to regulate them. On a global front, we established a strategic global partnership with ICMRA. I'm sure many of y'all are familiar with ICMRA. For those who are not familiar, well, it is the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Agencies or Authorities, and it's represented by heads of regulatory authorities, including the Health Sciences Authority. WHO is an observer of ICMRA. So ICMRA actually coordinates collective efforts to expedite and streamline the development, authorization, and availability of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines worldwide. It's an authoritative regulatory grouping that urges the global research community to prioritize and run large randomized controlled trials. So key characteristics of COVID-19 clinical trials most likely to generate conclusive evidence included those that were methodologically robust study design and the use of robust endpoints, those that had sufficient statistical power to conclude with reliable results, those that had realistic recruitment and completion capacity, and those that address an unmet medical need. So during the pandemic, there were regular teleconferences within ICMRA. So for myself, I was actually involved in a subcommittee that worked on a reflection paper for remote GCP inspections. And it was very enriching experience because it was intensive with the bi-weekly teleconferences and also a lot of online work, online as well as offline, because we had to draft the reflection paper from scratch and then discuss it as a group. But then it was also rewarding because it also benefited the inspection community by providing thoughts of how to do remote inspections, during the pandemic. So another way of regulatory facilitation was accelerating COVID-19 clinical trials. So what we did was we prioritized the review and approval of COVID-19 clinical trials during the pandemic. We had early engagement with sponsors and investigators through our innovation office. We also allowed for rolling submission, like I mentioned, of clinical trial applications. And this actually significantly reduced the regulatory review timelines from about 30 working days to as short as about 10 working days. So during the rolling submission, we encourage sponsors to submit non-clinical data, CMC data, draft protocol, and informed consent form, and the investigator's brochure. These could be submitted to HSA prior to the formal clinical trial application so that we could start reviewing them in parallel while the documents were still being developed and finalized. We also had continuous engagement with the sponsors as well as investigators during the review of clinical trials applications. For example, to actually give advice to our sponsors and investigators about how to operationalize the clinical trial during the pandemic. So I think one memorable engagement was where the clinical trial was actually conducted outside of an institution setting involving dormitory workers. And they were actually quarantined within the dormitory because they're actually foreign workers who are like construction workers. And basically is the trial staff had to actually be deployed to the dormitories in order to actually enroll and follow up the foreign workers in these dormitories. So there were a lot of remote assessments being done. And we had to also give guidance to the sponsors and investigators on how they could operationalize their clinical trial without compromising the goals of GCP. So in terms of another way of regulatory facilitation was to improve access to trial participants. For example, we developed alternative ways of obtaining consent for trial participants in isolation because the paper copy of their consent document had to be discarded because of infectious control. Okay. We also allowed for remote consent as well as electronic consent. So for more information about how we actually operationalize the remote consent and electronic consent, you can refer to our guidance on managing the clinical trials in relation to the COVID-19 situation, or the separate guidance on electronic consent. In terms of IP supply, so we enabled direct-to-patient service to participants' homes, and remote study visits, including home visits as well as telemedicine. And I shall elaborate a bit about that in my subsequent slides. We also enable electronic data capture, for example, the use of electronic clinical outcome assessments. So in terms of our regulatory guidance on the conduct of clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic, the important considerations were the safety of the participants, as well as the data integrity and quality. So in terms of enabling measures for informed consent, like I mentioned earlier, we facilitated this by enabling trial participants in isolation to be consented. So what was usually done was the investigator would actually be outside of the would be inside the hospital room, okay, but the coordinator would be outside the hospital room. So basically is once the investigator had actually explained the consent to the participant inside the isolation room, then the investigator actually took a snapshot of the consent document in terms of the consent form page itself and transmitted it to the coordinator waiting outside. And what the coordinator did was make sure that the signature page of the consent document was then filed together with a blank copy of the consent document and retained in either soft copy or hard copy. Okay, so in this way, then the signed informed consent document did not have to be brought outside of the isolation room because of infection control measures. We also allowed for remote consent. What we did was we actually implemented such that it could be done via video conferencing. And we also required that an impartial witness should participate in the remote consent process, regardless of whether the participant was unable to read, sign, or date. Because in our regulations, an impartial witness is required if the participant is unable to read, sign, or date. But notwithstanding that, we still impose the requirements for impartial witness for all types of remote consent. Okay. Then electronic consent was also implemented, but this was not really taken up by many sponsors. So basically is the more common one was the first two. So the important considerations were that the right, safety, and well-being of the participants must be safeguarded. Data security, confidentiality, reliability, integrity, and quality should be assured. The basic principles of consent, which are outlined in the Bellman report, being information, comprehension, voluntariness are assured, and regulatory provisions for informed consent are complied with. The next thing is we enabled was IP supply. So like I mentioned earlier, we facilitated the direct patient supply of the investigational products to the participants' home if it was possible for them to self-administer the investigational products themselves. But other options that were facilitated were allowing the participant to go to a remote medical facility for IP administration, or switching the participant to a commercial supply, or switching the participant to standard of care, or even allowing the sponsors if they actually requested to discontinue the study treatment. So some important considerations for IP supply were the safety of participants, IP security, accountability, traceability, and compliance to IP storage requirements, as well as PI oversight, because these study assessments were not being done within the constraints of the trial site. So if the participant was actually to receive the investigational product at home and administer it himself or herself at home, it was important for the PI to have that oversight, including, for example, deciding when it was suitable for the participant to start administration, and whether there were anything to be observed after administration, including adverse events, as well as to maintain accountability. In terms of enabling study visits, we actually facilitated the participants visiting remote facilities for laboratory and diagnostic tests, as well as remote consultations, including audio and video calls. So what was actually more popular in Singapore was actually the remote consultations. In terms of remote facilities, that was not so common because Singapore is a very small country compared to most of your countries. So, if the participant can actually make his way to a remote laboratory or a diagnostic facility, they could actually make their way to the trial site itself because it's not very much further. Okay. So important considerations were, again, the safety of the participants could be reasonably assured through the alternative efficacy and safety monitoring approach. Then data security, confidentiality, reliability, integrity, and quality have to be assured, as well as, again, there has to be sufficient PI oversight. We also enabled site monitoring visits by the sponsor because of visit restrictions. The monitors were not able to physically visit the trial sites to conduct trial monitoring. So what were the options given were maybe cancellation or postponement of the on-site monitoring visits, or perhaps trying to enhance the centralized monitoring of electronic systems, or remote monitoring. But for remote monitoring, there were some restrictions imposed by our local institutions in terms of remote access to medical records, because currently in Singapore, remote direct access to medical records is actually not allowed. Okay, so we had to come up with alternative measures such that the sites were required to redact the source documents and transmit it in a secure manner to the monitor, so that the monitor could do remote source document verification. And then at the next possible on-site visit, these source documents that had been reviewed remotely had to be re-monitored or re-verified. So important considerations, again, was to adopt a risk-based approach to monitoring, and also to focus on data and processes that are critical to protecting the rights, safety, and well-being of trial participants, and data integrity and quality. Data security, confidentiality, reliability, integrity, and quality are assured, and the burden that may be imposed to site staff and facilities is reduced. Because, when you get the site staff to actually make redacted copies for the purpose of remote source data verification or source data review, then basically it requires the site staff to spend additional time to make copies of the affected source documents and then to redact them and then transmit them and ensure that they have been transmitted accurately and completely. Okay, so this creates more work for the site staff, and which was over and above their constraints of working within the pandemic environment. So you realize that we have done a lot to facilitate the conduct of clinical trials during the COVID-19 pandemic through regulatory facilitation. And this basically resulted in the need to future-proof and optimize clinical trials, okay, right from the beginning. So even from the study design itself, we would highly recommend sponsors and investigators to consider quality by design, where you build quality into the design of the clinical trial. And also you consider the critical to quality factors that impact human subject protection, as well as the data integrity. Because moving forward, if you can actually build it into your clinical trial during the design stage, then there's less likely of any disruption, or disruptions will be minimized if there's another pandemic that happens in future. Okay. So in terms of future-proofing, well, now it's basically the new era of decentralized clinical trials, or what we usually call clinical trials with decentralized elements. Okay, so actually, I do actually sit on the expert working group of ICH E6 Revision 3, where I represent the Health Sciences Authority as a topic lead. And we have actually currently released the draft guideline for Annex 1 on considerations for interventional clinical trials. Additionally, we are also working on Annex 2, which is additional considerations for interventional clinical trials, focusing on clinical trials with decentralized elements, pragmatic elements, as well as real-world data. So sometime, probably maybe second quarter next year, you should be receiving the draft of Annex 2, which will give you ICH's recommendations for clinical trials involving decentralized elements, pragmatic elements, as well as real-world data. So basically, is in future, it might actually increase the need for virtual clinical trials, where some decentralized elements may be introduced. For example, like remote consent or electronic consent, home visits, telemedicine, visits to other facilities for laboratory and diagnostic tests. IP supply may be actually supplied directly to the participant's location, or increased use of digital tools like wearable and sensors that monitors your health data on continuously. So for clinical trials with decentralized elements, they can complement the traditional clinical trials, but in my opinion, not completely replace them. They have benefits like increased recruitment and retention rates, increased efficiency of data collection, as well as improved data quality. But conversely, it also poses some challenges, which have to be overcome. For example, they increase the cost, resources, and time for setup. There may be some unfamiliarity or reluctance by trial participants in using these decentralized elements. There could be increased data variability because of the different types of data sources which are used to collect the data. Okay, as well as there could be privacy as well as confidentiality concerns. Okay, because with the use of all these remote options. So notwithstanding any form of decentralized element, we would welcome sponsors to consult HSA on their plans prior to implementation. So I've come to the end of my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions if you have.
Thank you, Sumitra, once again for your wonderful presentation. And now we were able to have a scene from your presentation on how the pandemic really has brought the changes for the global regulatory environment. So now I would like to open, just like she said, the floor for Q&A session. And for on-site participants, if you have questions, please raise your hand and we will deliver a microphone to you for your speak. And for virtual participants, please leave your questions in the chat box. All right, anyone has a question? Yes, Dr. Zhang. Will you please give her a microphone, please?
Thank you very much for your kind and comprehensive speech. I would like to have a question about the keeping the blindness during the remote consent. A remote decentralized clinical trial. If you, I would like to ask to share your experience regarding when you're doing the decentralized clinical trial. Do you have any difficulties in keeping the blindness? And the second question was about the data integrity. So how do you recommend about the regulatory preparedness to evaluate the data integrity?
Thank you. So I will address the first question. We did not actually encounter any problems in maintenance of study blind through use of decentralized elements because the sponsors have actually built in sufficient safeguards to maintain the study blind, similar to even the on-site traditional clinical trials. So far, we have not encountered any problems with maintenance of study blind through decentralized elements because the roles and responsibilities of the blinded and the unblinded team still have to be clearly delineated or segregated. So that shouldn't be a problem. The second question, so it was to do with, can you repeat that again, please, about the data integrity, right?
Yes, what would be the regulatory preparedness for evaluation of data integrity?
So basically, again, the principles for data integrity should not differ for traditional on-site clinical trials and clinical trials with decentralized elements. I think what we would recommend is whatever methods that you want to use for data collection, that they are validated. And the study staff are actually trained on using it, and basically they are also monitored, because what's important is it's not only sufficient to restrict your trial monitoring to only what happens on site, but even these remote elements, for example, like the decentralized elements, they also have to be monitored. So the QC should be there apart from the QA also. So all this will help to actually improve the data quality as well as the integrity.